Good day, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to attend this webinar with our special guest, Dr. Ilan Pappe, and we apologize for the delay. Dr. Pappe will be speaking to us on the Christian Zionist lobby and the atrocities that are still happening in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. I am Feda Tota, one of the board members of the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace, or PCAP. We are a group of Christian Palestinian Americans working with Christian ecumenical partners and interfaith allies to educate and mobilize American Christians and U.S. churches about the plight of the Palestinian people, emphasizing the fact that there are fellow Christians in Palestine in need of their solidarity. Today's event is co-presented with Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA, and John Noble, who is also behind the scenes moderating this webinar, will say a few words about FOSNA.
Everyone, my name is John Noble. I am the Director of Development at Friends of Sabeel North America. Friends of Sabeel North America is a Christian voice for Palestine that acts in solidarity with the Sabeel Center in Jerusalem. We promote justice, peace, nonviolence, and an end to occupation, apartheid, and genocide by mobilizing Christian partners around the world, but particularly in the United States, to act in solidarity with Sabeel and with the Palestinian people as a whole. We are greatly honored to be co-hosting this event with PCAP. Greatly honored to have Dr. Pappe here with us today, and very glad that you all are also here with us today. Thank you so much.
I just want to say also that this is being recorded, and if we have an overflow, it will go to YouTube. Facebook.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. We also would like to thank our many co-sponsors of this webinar, the American Muslims for Palestine, Pax Christi, Episcopal Peace Fellowship, Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, Jewish Voice for Peace, DC chapter, Orthodox Christians for Palestine, Unitarian Universalist for Justice in the Middle East, United Church of Christ, Palestine-Israel Network, United Methodist for Kairos Response, Voices for Justice in Palestine, Joining Hands for Justice in Palestine, Israel, Israel-Palestine Mission Network, and Churches for Middle East Peace. And just a few things before we get started. Everyone in the audience will be muted. And as Philip said, it's going to be recorded. We will send the recording to everyone who has registered, and we urge you to share it with people that you think would be interested. Please ask any questions you have in the chat. PCAP's Philip and I will collect the questions for the Q&A session. If you want to make comments, please be brief and civil. Now, PCAP's Dr. Awad Halabi will engage our guest, Dr. Pappe, in a discussion of his most recent book, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, for about 45 minutes, with comments towards the end on the current situation in the region. This will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Anyone who donates $100 or more to PCAP will receive a free copy of Dr. Pappe's book. Now, before we begin, Reverend Alex Awad will say a word of prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, our hearts are heavy with pain for the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Israel, in Palestine, and in Lebanon. How long, O Lord, will the people of Gaza continue to suffer? How long will the hostages and prisoners continue to languish? Intervene and end the bloodshed and violence. Bless our speaker this morning, this afternoon or evening. May the things we learn through him help us become better advocates of your peace. Let our words and thoughts be acceptable to you, Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen. And now to our event and a brief introduction of our two interlocutors. Dr. Awad Halabi is an associate professor in the departments of history and religion at Wright State University, focusing on the modern Middle East and Islam. His numerous publications include his recent book, Palestinian Rituals of Identity, the Prophet Moses Festival in Jerusalem, 1850 to 1948. Dr. Ilan Pappe is a professor of history at the University of Exeter and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies. He is the author of numerous books, including the acclaimed The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And now I turn it over to Dr. Halabi.
Well, it's an honor for you to join us, Ilan. There have been some great works on the Israel lobby, such as Mearsheimer and Waltz, the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, and Walter Hickson's Architects of Repression. And with your work, I think you've really made a monumental contribution in this more than 500-page, thoroughly researched study of the origins of the Israel lobby and Christian Zionism, the lobby's collaboration with Christian Zionism, and how the lobby for almost a century and a half has pressured, intimidated, threatened, harassed governments, politicians, church leaders, activists, trade unionists, and fellow Jews to support Israel's settler colonial project. So it's wonderful for us to be able to talk about your new great book. And maybe we can begin by discussing how you open your book by identifying a conundrum that you're trying to understand to explain why the lobby even exists. Can you explain this conundrum?
Yes, thank you, Awad. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. I do apologize if you'll hear some noisy background. I'm in a vicinity where people are celebrating something or not or another, so there will be some background noises. I hope not too disturbing. I do apologize for that, but I hope you can hear me loud and clear, yes, which is more important than anything else. Yes, let me answer your question, Awad. It is a conundrum, not so much when the lobby started. When you start a project, which is quite imaginary, it doesn't yet unfold as a reality. When you talk about something that some people might even call utopia, then it makes sense that you want to advocate for it with all your strengths, with all the efficient tools that an advocacy group would have. The conundrum for me was not so much the fact that there was a Zionist lobby when Zionism first appeared as an idea. The conundrum for me is, why does Israel still need a lobby today? That's the conundrum. Why are the Israelis probably the only country in the world that still tries to convince people that it has a right to exist, that still uses so much energy, resources, intimidation, I would even call it sometimes terror, in order to make sure that nobody provides any profound challenge, well, whether it's a moral challenge, a political challenge, to the right of the state to exist, to the validity of the Zionist project, to the moral justification for what Zionism did when it arrived to Palestine and what it did ever since it arrived in Palestine. And I think that the way that this advocacy works today, and this is an advocacy that has been going on for more than 100 years, to my mind, indicates that the advocates themselves understand that they have a real problem with justifying the commodity that they advocate for, namely a Jewish state in the midst of the Arab world, imposed by force on millions of Palestinians against their will, and unwilling to grant the Palestinians, ever since it arrived, equality, dignity, and rights, and is busy all the time in trying to get as much of Palestine as possible, which already they have succeeded by 1967, and have in it as few Palestinians as possible. So it is trying to sell a project that only can be explained or can only be materialized by force against the will of the people, and yet it wants to have a moral justification, maybe from its own people, maybe from the Jewish people, maybe from people who supported the idea to begin with, and definitely against anyone who challenges the morality and the moral validity, one can say, of this project.
Is this why Canada and Australia, as you write, don't have lobbies that are supposed to justify what they did to the native and indigenous people of those lands?
Sorry, I didn't hear well the question.
Is that why Canada and Australia don't have lobbies to justify what
yes.
they did to the indigenous and native
Indeed.
peoples of their lands?
No, they so far they satisfy themselves with symbolic days of sorry, with rituals that ask for forgiveness for something which is already an established fact. The situation, of course, in Palestine is very different. The project of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian, the project of what Edward Said used to call the project of displacement of the Palestinians and their replacement by Jewish settlers is incomplete. The Palestinians have a national resistance movement that is not giving in. And therefore, that resistance movement itself even makes the project even more brutal, even more ruthless, and it's making it more difficult to defend it. Now, this kind of dynamics do not exist anymore in genocide, in the genocide projects of North America and Australia that somehow ended by the mid-19th century. I'm not saying that, of course, the indigenous people of these countries have disappeared and that they're not fighting a very just struggle for justice and equality. But I think it is they are not challenging the project of settler colonialism in those places in the same ferocity and the same energy with which the Palestinians do, because the Palestinians don't want to get to that final scene that already unfolded in other settler colonial projects.
Right, right. I think what you do of such a great job is explaining how Zionism in so many ways has its roots in Christian evangelical Zionism that promotes the really relatively new ideas of a return or restoration of Jews to Palestine in the 19th century. Because it's not some kind of peripheral theology, but it's the core belief of Christian Zionism and part of what motivates so many Christians, as well as the language of the lobby. Can you explain how this is not so much part of a traditional Christian understanding of the Holy Land and of end times, but it's a new eschatological end times belief in two very important new terms: dispensationalism and millenarianism. They both come up throughout the discussion of your book. Can you briefly explain these terms?
Yeah, definitely. And you're right, it's a relatively new idea that somehow emerges in the beginning of the 19th century in Britain, is taken by the people who conceived these ideas to the United States. So it transits from Britain to the United States and back from the United States to Britain, kind of. People reinforce their own theology by having these two power-based the two bases of theological thinking on these issues. One idea, or maybe the two ideas can be even explained together for the brevity of time. The idea, there is a basic element that connects a return of the Jews to Palestine, namely after, according to that narrative, after being exiled in the Roman Empire, a return as an indication for the beginning of the fulfillment of a divine scheme that eventually would lead to the resurrection of the dead, precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the beginning of the end of time. And there's a whole, as you probably, many of you would know, there's a whole eschatology connected to this apocalyptic vision. What is so important in this particular instance, from a theological point of view, which by the way also exists in Judaism, interesting, is the question of whether such monumental events happen only when God wants them to happen, or can the faithful do something to accelerate the process? Or if they do part of the plan themselves, they are the indicators themselves that the plan is already in motion. Why do I say it reminds me of Judaism? Because as you probably know, ultra-Orthodox Jews are anti-Zionist, because they say the creation of the Jewish state before the arrival of the Messiah is tempering with the will of God. But the religious Zionists say, no, the fact that we have already built a state is an indication that the Messiah is around the corner. And this is a similar idea, kind of saying the restoration of the Jews is the beginning of the process and not an outcome of the process, or maybe even ignites the process. How do they reconcile it with more traditional Christianity? How do they reconcile it even with mainstream evangelical Christianity? Well, we know that all kinds of other external ideas affect our interpretation of the faith, of religion. It could be anti-Semitism, it could be excitement about messianism, self-serving people who would like to be the new prophets. I'm sure there's a lot still to be done on that material. For me, what was important is that there were the early advocates in the modern time for the return of the Jews as a religious imperative. And they definitely had a powerful message, because we know today millions of Americans still believe that this is the right theological perception of Israel. And there are also some pockets of fundamentalist Christians also outside the United States. So yes, you had here a clear theological vision that the making of a Jewish state in Palestine as a result of the return of the Jews ignites a process that is apocalyptic and one that has many stations, as those of you are familiar with the theology, but I won't go into it, how it should unfold.
And I think that's why we could describe the lobby. I think, would you agree that it's the political manifestation of these theological beliefs? It's not just someone's spiritual beliefs, it puts it into action to create Zionism's settler colonial project. And that's why you referred to the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was president of the Bible Society in England in the 1860s, that he transformed from millenarian eschatology to millenarian activist. He's the first one to pressure governments. He didn't just believe this, he thought it had to be enacted through the governments.
Absolutely, and this is exactly what happened to the Bible Society, if you want, on the Jewish side. What you have here is either imperialists in the case of Shaftesbury and his friends in the evangelical Christian church, or colonialist in the case of some of the early Jewish leaders of Zionism, who take the Bible. It's interesting, they take the same book, the Old Testament, not the New Testament, take the Old Testament, the Bible, and transform it from a spiritual book, a book that tells you how to deal with God, how to deal with each other, into an historical document, in the case of Judaism, and into a prophetic document in the case of Christian Zionism. And there is a political motivation behind it, undoubtedly. I would even say that a bit later on, some of the evangelical Christians, especially in the United States, also have economic interests. This is not, it's not purely political only. There are interests in the Middle East, there are interests in Russia that are also connected to it. But what you have here is politicizing the religious message, which, as we know, happened in Islam as well, happens now in India with Buddhism as well, the one that Modi is propagating. Yeah, nothing new in this in many ways, apart from this bizarre kind of fact that one small piece on earth with a small community of people are being targeted by these people with global and universal messianic messages that begin a process that would end with their catastrophe as a result of that. And that's something very, very unique, you know, if you look at the trajectory from that kind of theology to what happened just a century later to the people of Palestine as a result of these ideas that, as you rightly say, do not remain, are not eschatological anymore. They become political programs. Right. And of course, then they find more secular allies, imperialists, colonialists, capitalists, who jump on the wagon, don't mind at all if it is described as a religious project, that's okay. But their interest is not religious at all. The best example, of course, are the early Zionist activists who were secular Jews, that led me and others to say that there were Jews who did not believe in God, but believed that God promised them Palestine.
Right. So it's not just religious beliefs, and it's not just imperialist visions that Zionism fulfills British imperial interests of having a friendly regime in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's also, you highlight, there are anti-Semitic motivations. And we see that especially with Lord Balfour and the Declaration of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, that for him, he has different anti-Semitic motivations to support Zionism. Particularly, if you want to talk about that, the
yes,
Jewish immigrants.
Definitely. Well, I would say, first thing I would say, the success of Zionism in a way is that it catered to different interests, and it served different interests. So in Zionism, as a way of fulfilling their own objectives, even if some of these objectives contradicted each other. For example, among the people who supported Zionism, whether they were Christians or Jews, there were also people who were Philo-Semites, namely people who really wanted to save Jews from anti-Semitism, because let's remember that the background for the emergence of the Jewish Zionist movement was the increase in anti-Semitic movements in Europe as a result of the rise of Romantic nationalism in the second half of the 19th century. The Romantic nationalist movements in Europe that broke down the European empires inside Europe were very they were connected to the Catholic Church, and they were looking for a way of purifying the race of the new Romantic national movements, and the Jews were the easy target to show who is really a patriot and who isn't. So there was, and I think there were a lot of Jews and Christians who did understand that this is going to be even worse than just a pogrom here and there. And at the same time, the most important supporters are people who are anti-Semites, as you said. So the contradicting kind of things here. Now, what is interesting about the anti-Semites in this powerful alliance that eventually would turn Palestine from an Arab state into a Jewish state and would lead to the displacement of the Palestinians and their destruction and everything that we see today, is that some of these anti-Semites were Jews themselves and not just Christians. What united Lord Balfour, who was a Christian, and Lord Rothschild, who was, as you know, a Jew, and other British aristocrats who from a Jewish origin, or American Jews who already were quite successful economically in the United States at the time that Zionism emerges, is a fear that anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe would push the poor Jews to Britain and the United States. And whether you were a Jew or a Christian who had belonged to the elite, you didn't like this prospect. And they talked, what I found, why did I write a book of 500 pages? Because I said, I need to bring long quotes so that people would believe me that that's how people wrote and talk. Otherwise, you would think, oh, maybe I'm interpreting something. It's not a very interpretive book. This is a book that allows the reader to go into the material themselves. You have to hear it to believe it, rather than for me to be the messengers and telling you, you know how these people talk. You can hear the way they talk about the danger of the Jews from Eastern Europe coming to Britain. And not only Arthur Balfour, but also Anglo-Jewish aristocrats are saying it. So yes, this was a powerful motivation behind the reorientation of Jews from especially the poor areas of Europe into Palestine. Now, this is something, it's an historical structure. This unity of purpose between anti-Semites and Zionists exists to this very day, because both movements want to see the Jews outside of Europe, outside of the West. By default, it's an alliance. It's an alliance. You don't want the Jews to stay in Britain, and I don't want the Jews to stay in Britain. I want them all to be in Palestine. So that's where you are bedfellows, whether you like it or not, into this idea. And then it becomes, of course, more cynical. And even in the early days, the rise of violent anti-Semitism gives more incentive to Jews to go to Palestine. Palestine was not that attractive to most Jews to begin with. It is not a culture and a geography and a climate that they were used to. They didn't really go in their hundreds to Palestine. So it was a blessing for Zionism, actually, that anti-Semitism became, on the one hand, more violent, and secondly, that the anti-Semites in the West, in the United States, especially in Britain, were powerful enough to put quotas on the number of Jews that can come to the United States and Britain. So these two things together pushed many more Jews than I think would have otherwise were going to Palestine as settlers.
I want to pick up on a couple points. One is I think I've never heard this before. It's a brilliant point. You say that the Zionist activists identified Jews in Eastern Europe and in Palestine as a nation. Therefore, they should have their own rights. But they didn't designate Jews in England, France, Canada as a nation, because that would bring up dual loyalty. So they're more than happy to say, they really don't belong there, get them out, but we get to stay. Is that right?
Absolutely. I learned about it because I was lucky. I got the minutes of the most important, the early important Zionist convention in America in 1918. an outfit called the American Jewish Congress was inaugurated in Pennsylvania in 1918. And the minutes of that meeting include speeches by people like Brandeis and Judge Brandeis and others. And at first I didn't understand, why are they devoting so much time to explain that Jews are a nation in Russia, Romania, Poland, and Palestine, but not in Britain and the United States. And of course, you're absolutely right. The problem would, if they are a nation also in Britain and the US, they would be accused of Jew loyalty. So they explain, they actually don't explain, they state. There's no explanation, because how can you explain it? What's the difference? What's the difference, right? They don't explain, because there's no analysis that can explain it. But they state, and the Congress accepts it, that Judaism is nationalism in certain locations and not nationalism in others. But I think below it, there's even a deeper layer, the one that I already found in the diary of Theodor Herzl, where he recorded his conversations with leading Germans and British politicians, where he said to them very clearly two things. He said, the Jews in your country, the wealthy Jews, the important Jews, don't worry, they would never go to Palestine, he tells them. You shouldn't worry about that. And on the other hand, the Jewish proletariat, as he called it, the working class of the Jews, would not come and make trouble in your own countries. These are the words of Herzl. This is not the words of an anti-Semitic, pundit. And this is there all the time. It becomes part of the DNA in many ways, and is important to understand that Palestine became this receptor of, among other things, for a problem that was really created by anti-Semitism and racism towards Jews. And then, of course, the Zionist project itself became a project of racism towards the Palestinians.
Right. Excellent point. And just one final point. You make a great point that if the Zionist activists during World War II had pestered the U.S. to admit more Jews into the U.S., it would have been, they would have lost that close political connection they had with Washington politicians. So they were a little more cautious in how they pressured the U.S. administration.
Also in Britain.
And in Britain, the same thing. Interesting. Let's move on to this larger topic of what you refer to as the Holy Trinity of Christian Zionists, Zionist activists, and the neoconservatives, or this unholy Trinity, sorry. And, and you identify that after World War II, Zionism, Christian Zionism becomes less mystical, more realist. Theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, who was criticized the Nazis, opposed segregation in the U.S., but was a staunch supporter of Israel and Zionism. He kind of is the bridge between the religious and the right-wing what becomes the right-wing neoconservatives later in the Republican Party. And we see how does, like, what I would like to hear more of is how do the neoconservatives work so closely with a religious group? Because the Christian Zionists have religious motivations to support Zionism. The neoconservatives have mostly U.S. and imperialist motivations to support Israel. How do the two blend together and almost seem as one?
Yes, I think that the key for this kind of coalition is, first of all, the membership in both in AIPAC, the main pro-Israeli lobby that precedes the phenomenon of neoconservatism. AIPAC is much older than the neoconservative think tanks and movement. And some of the people who work for AIPAC work for the early neocon think tanks. So, and they are actually creating their less a Christian Zionist atmosphere, but much more develop a new narrative that is the narrative that says that actually the creation of the State of Israel was meant to help in the Cold War, first of all, against the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union sort of disappears, they all adopt these Samuel Huntington ideas of the clash of civilization, and therefore Israel now is the bastion, or the last bastion, against the barbaric civilization, whichever it is, that endangers the West in general, in particular the United States. So I think that the first alliance is between the neocons and AIPAC, which is a very important alliance. And you know, some of the early leaders of AIPAC even left AIPAC the moment that alliance was solidified, like Tom Dine, who used to be the vice president of AIPAC. And he said in an interview that he suddenly realized that the holy kind of principle in AIPAC of being bipartisan was totally neglected by a new generation of people who were leading AIPAC in the late 80s and the beginning of in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. The alliance that was begin to be to emerge in the Republican Party between Christian Zionists and neocons was the one that was eventually brought into the fold as the last leg in this unholy trinity. So I think what you had here is different interests, but that are translated into the same objective, namely a very Islamophobic perception of reality, an anti-Arab perception of reality, and this strong belief that the United States needs to use force in order to protect its own national interests and the interests of its allies. This went together later with a more simplistic and maybe a more idiotic slogan, "Make America Great Again," but doesn't matter. The ideas are there. And I think already Walt and Mishmeyer and Walt, very well presented to us the evidence that this unholy trinity was very much behind the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But it was there, of course, before. So I think that this is the kind of repeat on the early alliance that enabled a small group of Jewish settlers to set foot in Palestine and eventually ethnically cleanse the Palestinians because they had this powerful alliance behind them. It's the same idea because the alliance is made of components that might not always have a lot in common, but the very project of a Jewish state, of what they might think of as a Western state, as a pro-American state, which is not Arab, which is not Muslim, kind of ignited the imagination of different groups of people for different reasons. And I think AIPAC's main role was to make sure that you can cement these visions and ideologies into one powerful impact on the way American policy is perpetrated on the ground.
Right. I know we're getting close to the end of time of our discussion, and we're going to open it up to larger discussions. But I wanted to ask a couple more questions. One, Jimmy Carter is seen as the ideal president. He's openly evangelical, but he has been the recipient of this vitriol from the Israeli lobby. And Barack Obama, I think, is an interesting case, especially after 2009 in his speech in Cairo, where he is the first president to mention the Nakba and calls for Palestinian statehood. But you make the point that the Christian, pro-Israel Zionist lobby played second fiddle to the Christian Zionists, as you have Glenn Beck and Fox News constantly berating him. But then you ask the question that he eventually abandoned trying to challenge Israel on the question of Palestinians. And you ask the question, was there an alternative? Can you tell us how you answer that?
Well, there was an alternative to
Obama's ability to try to challenge Israel. He kind of just gave up because of the pressure.
Oh yeah. I see what you mean. When I read about Obama and I read his own autobiography and thinking about how he moans in the book of how he was tortured by the pro-Israeli lobby and how eventually many things that he wanted to do he couldn't do because of the power of the lobby. I was also thinking about Jeremy Corbyn in Britain being ousted from the leadership of the Labour Party by the pro-Israeli lobby in Britain. And in both cases, I'll put Carter aside because it's a different historical period and it's difficult to judge what could have been done or could not have been done in the early 70s. But Obama belongs to a period we are more familiar with, which definitely already offered options, different options. Yes, it is a matter of adopting something which maybe is not human, but has to be adopted as a recipe for the future. There is a sense that also in the way Obama and Corbyn and others behave, that they really think that there is a kind of a logical discussion here going on, that the other side has an issue, and maybe you should accommodate this issue. So maybe there is a golden mean between your position and their position. So you're trying to show genuinely that you, of course, also care about what they care, but there are other people you care about, the Palestinians. And you somehow think that this ability of yours to accommodate, to compromise, to come towards the other side is something that would be reciprocated. If I would put it bluntly, a far more assertive Obama and a far more assertive Corbyn and others who would not cave in because they already were in powerful position would have weathered the storms against them. However, they somehow did not understand. If I put it in the most simple term, I think I even used this phrase in my book. If you don't stand and sing the Israeli anthem with the Israelis, you are the enemy of Israel. You cannot be a good friend of Israel and critical of Israel, which is what they thought they could do. You can't, because, and this is also maybe a misunderstanding of how dramatic, that's why I don't go to Carter, but how dramatically Israel changed after 2000. That Israel was, and anybody with and even a modicum of knowledge of Israel could already state in 2000, there is no alternative to the right wing in Israel. And Israel will be a right-wing country, an extremist country, a racist, aggressive country that would do to the Palestinians whatever inhibitions in the past prevented them from doing. This was all there in the. I wrote about it already in 1999, and I wasn't the only one. But this image that Israel is a complicated society, that American pragmatism has its interlocutor on the Israeli side, all this made it was like two sides. One side was behaving like the mafia, and the other side was behaving like a diplomatic corps. And the diplomatic corps was surprised that in the end of the day, someone came and shot them rather than continue the dialogue when they had enough of the dialogue. And that's where Obama totally failed. Not only him, I think also the people around him. Remember who was around Obama advising him on Israel and Palestine? Kind of liberal Zionists who were very important in formulating policy, believing probably genuinely that peace is around the corner, that a better Israel is around the corner, that there is a peace camp, all kinds of assumptions which were totally wrong, had nothing to do with the reality, and weakened their ability to face AIPAC and its power in Capitol Hill. And eventually they all, succumbed to that power. Take someone like Martin Indyk, who was a powerful man in AIPAC. Towards the end of his life, he was very critical of Israel and immediately became the enemy of Israel. They didn't even remind anyone of the fact that he was running AIPAC for years. That doesn't count. That doesn't count. The moment you utter a word of criticism, everything you did in the past is erased. And there's only two dimensions to this. Either you're an enemy or a friend. There's nothing in between. And I think you would have expected a powerful person at the head of the executive arm to be able to withstand such tactics. But we'll see. Maybe it will. I'm not deterministic. I hope this will happen one day.
Final question for me, Ilan. We're now nearing almost 1 year of a genocide in Gaza and now a regional war. How important has the lobby been in supporting Israel throughout their war crimes? And how do you explain the support President Biden has given to Israel, who describes himself openly as a Zionist?
President Biden began his career in the Foreign Affairs Committee on Capitol Hill the day Israel ended the career of Senator Fulbright. I have no doubt, I haven't talked to President Biden, and maybe someone should, if he will be honest enough. I think he understood very well how Capitol Hill works in regard to AIPAC. Remember how powerful Fulbright was and how dramatic was his the way AIPAC killed his political career. And I think it stayed with Biden. And Biden was an example for the American politicians who entered the political system in the early 1970s, which AIPAC already could rely on, that by inertia, without pressure, would support Israel, because they already had the example of what happened to Fulbright, who tried to take AIPAC head on. And I think that was a very important message to them. And they were not presidents and so on. So at the time, and I think that remains with you. That remains with you. This almost, it's part of your DNA as an American politician to know the red lines you should not cross, and you don't need to get a message again from AIPAC to remind you what are the red lines. And automatically, when an event like 7th of October unfolds and the Israeli reaction to it, there's almost, you can predict what would be said, what not be said, and what would be done or would not be done. As if really the personality of the president is even not important in that case. So AIPAC was there to make sure that these red lines were kept. And when the red lines are not kept, which mainly people would say Israel commits genocide or might ask for American sanctions against Israel, you saw what happened to some of the candidates, the uncommitted Democrats, some of who had not even a chance of being nominated, how much money and energy and power AIPAC used to kill their careers in order to assert its power again. So AIPAC is there to make sure that what it expects anyway to happen, namely that the American administration would talk the talk but would not walk the walk when it comes to Israel. It would not stop the genocide. It would not stop the Israeli criminal policies towards the Palestinians, but to make sure that this is still the case, given the fact that there's these really dramatic changes in American public opinion, in the willingness of a younger generation to challenge the American policy, or the uncommitted Democrats who become an electoral issue even, or have turned Palestine into an electoral issue, which we've never thought would ever happen in the United States. Namely, support for Palestine can help an electoral issue. All this, they are there just to make sure that these developments are like, are like small holes in the dam that have to be filled. Otherwise, they would burst. The dam would burst. By the way, I do think the dam will burst. I think just they don't have enough fingers to put in the various holes that already are there. And the dam is the immunity shield that AIPAC provides against any meaningful American policy that can bring an end to the genocide in Gaza and the suffering of the Palestinians in general.
Thank you, Ilan. I'm going to pass it over to Faida and I think Philip to moderate the questions. John, do you want to put them on the screen? I have to. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful discussion. And we've had a number of questions that came out in the chat, and maybe we can start where we are right now. And there was a question about, I know historians don't do predictions, but what do you think what's happening right now, the current genocide in almost all countries in the Middle East, like what can you see as an end?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, in the short run, I don't see any powerful intervention that would ease the suffering of the people, especially the people who live in Lebanon, the people in Palestine, and my heart goes for the Jews who were expelled, who had to leave their homes in the north of Israel. I don't think that there is much promise for a change. I don't think the Netanyahu idea that by force and more force you solve an issue that has to do with Israeli criminal policies rather than with the actions of the others. So I'm afraid that we are into much of the same and probably worse for a while. However, I'm much more optimistic about the more distant future. I don't think this will hold water. I do think that this neo-messianic Zionist ideology that most of the Israeli ministers subscribe to would increase the isolation of Israel, might even begin to impact some governments in the global north, definitely would impact governments in the global south, and that could become a powerful tool of sanctions and pressure that would limit the Israeli options to continue these kinds of policies. There is another dimension that I think the media is not totally aware of, and that's an enigma, and I cannot predict. But if you think about the Iran-Israel war, the war between Iran itself and Israel, it's quite incredible. Not one Israeli was killed by the Iranians, and almost not one Iranian was killed by the Israelis. So what you have here is two regional powers whose clash the victims of its clash are people in Lebanon and people in Palestine. So there is this need to go back to the issue of Palestine as the heart of the matter, not the clash between Israel and Iran. This is not the real war, that's the phony war. The real war is between the resistance movement of the Palestinians, who after 76 years of oppression, colonization and uprooting, and especially after 17 years of siege and starvation, had enough and resist, and the need to go to the source of the violence and to decolonize historical Palestine so that there would be no need for violent resistance against the settler colonial state of Israel, and that we can start thinking of building a different future. In that respect, I'm much more optimistic that there would be the opportunity to build something new, because the present regime in Israel, the present realities, the present ideology that holds Israel together is not sustainable for a long time. And Israel would not be the first failed state in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're already a failed state of Syria and Lebanon and far beyond in Libya and Yemen. The whole area has political structure that are not working. But if no one replaces them with a positive ideology of equality, of building a new reality, and so on, then this chaos can continue for longer and bring more suffering. And I would just send to the end that the reason I'm so hopeful about the future is because I'm thinking about a model that already existed. If I had to invent the wheel, I would have been less optimistic and I wouldn't talk about it too much. But I have a model, as not just in Palestine, by the way, in the whole Eastern Mediterranean, the Mashriq, but especially in Palestine, where Muslim, Christian, and Jews live together. So there is a model there that can be restructured, rebuilt. And because of that, I know that there is an alternative to the present reality. And for that alternative to be seriously considered by people with the power to implement it, you first need, unfortunately, for the destruction, the disintegration to continue for a while, so that there is a space for building something new. Sometimes you have to destroy an old building to the core in order to build a new one.
I guess I will take another question here. I'm trying to combine as many questions, and I plead with people to kind of reduce the number of comments in the chat, and so we can focus on questions for Dr. Pappe. One question, it should be really for the last question, but since we have limited time, I'm going to ask it now. So what, advice do you have for activists, to end the occupation, to start that process, towards that model that you think is a better model? We do have a great deal of support around the world. So what advice do you have for us activists, maybe particularly in the churches, but also more broadly?
Well, I think activism in churches and more broadly are part of the civil society. And we have a reality that is easy to analyze. There's a gap between what we in the civil society believe is the right American policy toward the situation in Israel and Palestine and the American policy itself. And I suppose our main duty is to narrow the gap between what we perceive as a moral policy, as an effective policy, as the right policy, and the policy that is actually being pursued. And I'm sure we all are doing all we can to achieve that objective of narrowing the gap. But if we are not narrowing the gap quickly enough, we probably have to do more in that respect. So I don't think there's much to criticize about the way people are committed to freedom and liberation in Palestine are acting in the United States. I think they're doing more and more. They are brave. Some of them are paying quite a price for that kind of commitment and solidarity. So it's just doing the same but more. And I don't have any recipe of something that wasn't done before. There's always things that you can improve. If you think about the encampments in the campuses, how do you turn that into a national organization rather than an atomized activity? How do you connect with other elements in civil society, like unions, in the action, minority groups, First Nations, and so on? I mean, there's still probably more to be done in order to widen the coalition for Palestine and solidifying it. But I think that this is something that does not only depend on our activism, unfortunately. And this leads me to say something else. I think that it's wrong to think that we are just dealing as activists for Palestine with changing American policy towards Palestine. I think we are part of something much bigger. And that is a challenge to the way politics is being done. It's not only on the matter of Palestine that we feel that politicians are serving themselves rather than our interests. So many other issues, they totally disregard our basic concerns about ecology, poverty, justice, and so on. And therefore, somehow Palestine has to become, and it already has in some places, the symbol for what is wrong with the essence of politics. This is something the left in the 1970s understood quite well and had some great successes in at least legitimizing the PLO in the world for a while. And I think we need to find a way of doing that again. Namely, a just policy towards Palestine is an indicator of a just policy towards other important issues. And an unjust policy towards Palestine is an indication that something is totally wrong and rotten with the political system as a whole. We have to find a connection, to find a good way to connect the two, not the two, all the struggles of injustices in America to the struggle against the American policy towards Palestine, and to explain to people that this is a very important symbol of what's wrong. And you know, in the global south, it's very clear to people. You can go to a demonstration of trade union in Pakistan or Argentina, and people would don themselves with a Palestinian flag because they would see this is the flag of a struggle for justice. This is not happening in the United States, but it's becoming. I mean, I can visually begin to see it. I visually begin to see it. I can see it in Britain among football fans, that is soccer fans for you Americans, donning the Palestinian flag. These kinds of things can be widened, and the pressure on the political system maybe can be more effective. But it will not be the only factor that would bring down the racist regime we have now in Israel. Luckily for us, this is going to collapse from within anyway. But the problem is it's a long process of collapse and disintegration, and with it comes a lot of violent manifestation of a state that is not succumbing to reason, morality, and peace. And therefore, we have to increase our efforts and increase the pace by which the external world changes its policy, because there will not be a change from within Israel, unfortunately, in the foreseeable future.
Thank you for that answer. And maybe having said that, we can go back to the DNA of Zionism. And there were a couple of questions that have to deal with the history of Zionism. And one of them was about whether it was always about displacing the native population. Like, was it always a settler colonial project? And a question, I'm not quite sure where it came from, but it does offer, it asks about whether Zionism is by its very nature anti-Palestinian.
It's a good question. No, I don't think it started as an anti-Palestinian movement. It was moved by two impulses. One impulse was to find a solution to anti-Semitism, and the other impulse was to make the Jews more, I would say, more secular, modern people. And the early Zionists connected the two. They thought that the Jews would be more modernized and more secularized. That would help to fight anti-Semitism. So at first, this was not anchored in the idea of building a nation state in Palestine necessarily. But then, at the beginning of the 20th century, most of the leaders of Zionism themselves became enchanted with the idea of romantic nationalism, the very kind of nationalism that brought anti-Semitism back to Europe, and developed their own ideas of romantic nationalism. And in romantic nationalism, you cannot exist as a nation without finding a place which you call your own, and which you can show that is the cradle of your civilization. And therefore, any ideas, even by Herzl himself, to settle Jews, not necessarily in Palestine, Herzl was thinking about Uganda as an option. And some other Zionists were thinking about North America, South America, Azerbaijan, all kinds of destinations were offered. But the moment the romantic nationalists among the Zionists took over, they needed, as from the romantic here is a very negative term. I know romanticism can sound as a very positive term. Romantic nationalism is a very negative definition of nationalism, because it's a very racist view on who belongs to the nation and who doesn't, and the nation needs a homeland, and the homeland existed in their mind only in one place, on which they knew from the Bible, Palestine. So in that moment, roughly 1900, it became a settler colonial project, not anymore a cultural project of redefining Judaism, resurrecting the Hebrew, or reawakening the Hebrew language, all positive things that went along with the Zionist project. But the moment it was honed on Palestine as the cradle of the old Jewish nation state that comes back to life, then it became anti-Palestinians by default, because the only way of creating a pure racist Jewish state with no one else who's not a Jew was to get rid of the indigenous native people who lived in Palestine. Nowadays, I think the only Jewish collective that I can foresee in the future, which I think is better for the Jews anyway, but that's my idiosyncratic idea, is that Jews would define themselves very much in the Middle East as other sects define themselves, whether the Yazidis, the Alawis, the Maronites, or Druze. There is a history of a mosaic of collective identities in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Jews can be another ethnocultural group, like the rest of the ethnocultural groups, and definitely be part of a democratic state for all between the river and the sea, based on equality and rectification of past evil through the return of the refugees. And I really think that this is the best one can offer the Jewish community in Israel after everything that happened the last 100 years. I realized that for so many Israeli Jews, this is unacceptable. They would like to continue and live in an apartheid state that gives them all the privileges, still believe that they have the power to impose themselves on the Palestinian and the area around them. But I think quite a lot of them understand it doesn't work, but somehow it's not easy to convince them that there is an alternative, despite the fact that they themselves say there's no horizon apart from continue to fight and make sure that you never lose the fight, which is now the current maxim among Israeli Jews. This is our destiny. This is our fate. The only thing we have to make sure that we never lose a war. This is insane. It's a lunatic nation, and it has to be healed. And the only way to heal it is by decolonizing historical Palestine.
Yes, okay. So there were a number of questions. By the way, I'm trying to combine as many questions as possible. I hope I'm covering lots of people. So a number of questions about, and you may have already answered it, but the third leg of the Trinity, and maybe related to that is, the Islamophobia that on which Israel, kind of capitalizes, and Zionism now really totes Islamophobia as one of its principal, really weapons, ideological weapons. But I don't know if it's related to the third leg of the Trinity.
Yes, I think it's Islamophobia is an attitude that all the legs in that Holy Trinity have, each with its own version of Islamophobia. And one has to define here Islamophobia carefully. This is not to do with people's knowledge of what is Islam, and whether they know what Muslim believe in or not believe in. I think that what really characterizes this attitude is a wish to ignore a very solid historical fact. And that solid historical fact is that the Arab world and Islamic civilization, not only Islamic religion, the Arab world and Islamic civilization go hand in hand for a millennium now. And not millennium, sorry. More than millennium, actually. More than millennium. And that creates a certain relationship, attitudes between Muslims and non-Muslims throughout the centuries. And therefore, there's no way of creating a Palestine that is excluded from that legacy, from that history, is what Israel is trying to do. And what is, again, I have to rely on the past to be optimistic that this misunderstanding of the connection to Islamic civilization would be rectified. If you think about it, it's not surprising that not one Zionist emerged among the Jews in the Muslim world. Why is that? Why nobody in the Muslim world who was a Jew talked about the need to build a Jewish state in Palestine? The early Zionists among the Arab Jews and the Muslim Jews were disciples of the Zionists in Europe. But they themselves have never conceived of the idea of building a Jewish state in Palestine as something that would make life better. Not that they didn't want to make life better. Everybody wanted to make life better. But they saw themselves very much in socioeconomic terms. Namely, if you were poor like your Muslim and Christian neighbors. If you were well off, you were well off like Christian and Muslim neighbors. Your identity very rarely, not that it didn't happen, but very rarely was a cause for miserable life. And therefore, you focused on how to make society better, not on building a Jewish state in Palestine as a panacea for the problems of the world. And maybe this kind of thing, because half of the Jews in Israel are originally from Arab and Muslim countries, this would one day even resonate with the Israeli Jews themselves. And if it resonates with them, it will resonate with their supporters outside. I'm not very optimistic about it because the Arab Jews in Israel underwent such a process of de-Arabization from above that developed in many of them Islamophobic and Arabophobic ideologies and attitudes. But I think in the long run, that might be an important theme to explore. But definitely, it's an unwillingness of all the legs in the Unholy Trinity to accept that Israel and Palestine and other parts that they covet in the Arab world cannot be extracted from the Arab world, cannot be extracted from the Islamic civilization, cannot be extracted from their past, their heritage, their legacy, and from their own right to solve the issues that they have, if they have, between themselves, which they have done quite well before imperialism from the outside interfered and with its own interests and made it a much more unstable and violent place to live in.
I think we have time for one or two questions, and
yeah,
one
I would
of
have
them,
to leave you at half of the hour. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I think the
these are crazy
question that
times. Yeah.
has been appearing quite often is about global Zionism, right? There's something about the power. Your book is about both sides of the Atlantic, dealing with the UK and Britain. But what about the global Zionist movement? Is it well organized, as in these two countries?
Yeah, well, I think I would call it global Israel rather than global Zionism, because the Zionist ideology, I think, is particularly important to people in Britain and the United States. I don't think it is something that people who support Israel outside these two countries necessarily subscribe to. I think what you have here is a global Israel, namely even a more powerful alliance that was at the time when Zionism emerged, where different countries, different multinational corporations, different parts of the military industry and security industry, or the financial system in the world, of course, Christian Zionists as well, Zionist Jews, right-wing parties, fascist parties, not only in Europe, but also in Southeast Asia, and authoritarian regimes that need arms and good connection with the Israeli know-how of how to oppress people. All this together creates a formidable material alliance that sustains Israel and compensate from the fact that Israel lost its moral alliance. It doesn't have a moral alliance. The moral elements in the world move to the global Palestine alliance, if you want. And that's why I kept saying that it's not just an issue of Palestine. It's an issue for all of us. What is politics about? Is politics really, as my colleagues in political science teach all over the world, it's a matter of power. It's a matter of power and more power. And if I know that students keep telling me that they keep hearing it from political scientists, that if they even raise the option that maybe there are moral values to politics, maybe there's a morality, maybe there's spirituality, maybe there is compassion, they are looked at as students who are in the wrong department. They send them to theater or I don't know, to do something else in life because this has nothing to do with politics. They are being scolded for being naive. We should find a way that these values that we believe in, and you have to believe in these values if you support Palestine, are more important than the material interests of those who benefit from the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. Nobody would materially win a lot from ending the oppression of the Palestinians, but the world will be a much better place to live in. And we somehow have to find a way of making sure that life is not judged all the time by these kinds of values of economic benefits, profits, and so on, because otherwise the Palestinians don't have much to offer. And their liberation doesn't have much to offer in that term. And Israel has a lot to offer. Imagine how many nasty regimes in the world want to buy the Israeli know-how of how to explode people's phones in their ears and blind them if possible. Imagine who are the clients in the queue now to buy Israeli goods? Are these people who want to build democracies? Are these people who want to build better societies? No, these are oppressive regimes who say, oh my God, there's even better way of controlling people's life against their will. So I think this is something which is wrong with the world that is manifested in the question of Palestine. But the young generation, I think, has a lot of energy now and zest and believes in these issues and are not deterred by condemnation of being naive and so on. And I hope one day when they reach positions of power, they will not forget the emotional and moral value system that now they are willing to die for. But there's always a danger when they become powerful that these kinds of commitments are being forgotten.
We want to be respectful of your time, so
Thank you.
you said you wanted to leave at 1:30.
I have to, I'm sorry.
Please, do, and we really greatly appreciate your this discussion, and we thank everybody, and we urge everybody, please register to receive material from PCAP and from FOSNA, and to donate as you can, especially Palestinian Americans. We wanted to connect with PCAP. FOSNA includes a bigger community. Please, Ilan, feel free to leave, and thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
again, I thank everybody for joining us, and please click on the links that Paul provided in the chat. I hope some of you already have, or just Google Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace or FOSNA, FOSNA, and join us.
Thank you, Fida. Thank you, Philip, and especially thank you, Awad Halabi, for your great questions. And of course, we are thankful to Ilan Pappe for his deep thinking and challenging remarks. And I thank you all for supporting FOSNA, supporting PCAP, and I want to encourage you to continue to work. Some of you are aware of a declaration that I wrote, and I'm encouraging people to send it to our political officials and to our president. If you have not received the declaration, write to us and we will send you a copy of the declaration. And God bless you all and keep you and protect you and continue to use you to bring about his peace. Thank you.